Hi everyone, and welcome to the game of the day, the first day of semifinal action at the Chess24 Legends of Chess tournament. Today we had two matches going on, one between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Giri, and I chose one of their games as the game of the day. We also had a match between Magnus Carlsen and Peter Svidler. Both matches ended up being a little bit quicker than some of the matches we've been accustomed to in the past. One player doing better than the other today, maybe in a little bit better shape. And so we're going to start with this game here. I chose this game. I like games with queen sacrifices. That's number one. And number two, I thought it was actually a really kind of instructive example of a positional sacrifice. So let's, without further ado, here we go. Jan here played e4. He's a pretty faithful e4 player. E5. Bishop c4. Now he does vary things, right? We saw him play the Scotch in a game in this event. He is a pretty he shifts things around in the opening as with white. Anish, of course, is a very well prepared player with both colors, and so he's a tough guy to kind of trick in the opening. He plays knight f6, d3, knight c6, and now Jan plays knight c3. So this is the bishop's opening, and the variation that Anish plays here is one of the very solid lines. You can also play c6 followed by d5. That's a different, sort of a completely different type of position. But the knight c6 line is considered super solid, knight c3. And now black has two options. In this game, Anish plays bishop b4. There's also knight a5, which again leads to different kinds of positions because usually white will let black take with the d pawn, and we have sort of a position where white has space and tries to really control the d5 square really well, but it leads to really slow play. Bishop b4 is a more concrete move because the idea of the move is that it prepares to play d5 as this knight is pinned, and white doesn't have time to castle out of it yet, so black can basically play d5 in the next move. The most popular move for white here is knight e2, but Jan plays knight f3. As usual, he kind of goes for something offbeat, just tries to get a playable position, and he does have sometimes some sneaky preparation in some of these lines. But in this game, I think it was more just trying to get a playable game rather than having some kind of deep preparation. Anish plays d6. d5 is certainly possible, and that's the main move when white plays knight e2. With the knight on f3, maybe white has a little bit more pressure against the e-pawn, so maybe he preferred not to do this, with the knight on f3 versus e2. Although of course, it's got to be totally playable for black to play a position like this and castle. I imagine black is okay. So he decides to play d6, which is of course totally reasonable. Castles, and now he takes on c3. Not obligatory. You could do something like h6. You might not want to let white get this pin without taking on c3, but you could wait to take on c3. Like if black, let's say, castled and white played bishop g5, you could certainly take on c3 now. And this actually does transpose, I think, to one of the main lines it's very similar to the main line of the four knights. I think the bishop would be on b5 there. But so that's possible as well. But Anish decides to just take on c3, b takes c3, and play knight a5. And certainly a reasonable choice too. Bishop b3, so you don't want to have tripled pawns, right? So, and here, the one thing about taking on c3 is that here, this structure is actually a pretty good structure for white. Even though they have a doubled pawn, it's capturing towards the center. And I like this structure for white. You have the possibility to play, c4, c3, try to play d4, b4, b5. White tends to have a lot of space here. So that is something with the knight a5 plan that is a little bit... maybe a little bit less than optimal. That being said, of course, it's very solid for black. h6. So he prevents, now that he's traded his dark squared bishop, that pin could be a little bit more annoying, so he plays h6. h3. Queen e7. Normal looking move. Of course, possible to castle, possible to play bishop d7, something like that. But queen e7 looks good. Now Jan makes a move that... creates a more imbalanced position. He plays knight h2 with the rather thinly veiled intention of playing f4 and trying to trade a wing pawn against the center pawn. And it's very logical. You see this in this type of position with both white and black, right? Sometimes black castles, plays king h8, tries to move the knight, play f5. It's a very typical plan. And so now Anish takes on b3. surely thinking that if this f-file is going to be open, I don't want the bishop to be here. That being said, I did wonder after seeing the game whether playing g5 right away, so Anish took on b3 and then played g5. I do wonder if maybe playing g5 first could have been a slight improvement. The idea being that in these positions where he's going to play bishop d7, he may not want to castle on the king side. And if he kind of keeps this knight takes b3 in hand, you might consider castling queen side as long as the a file is not open and just saying, you know, I'll take on b3 when I have to, but not force it. So that would have been interesting. For example, you know, we could, if we play similarly to the game, rook e1, rook g8, knight f1, and now you could play a move like bishop d7. And there's not necessarily urgency to take it because that bishop is not really going anywhere. And so potentially he could take it later. So in the game, he takes, pawn takes b3, and then plays g5. Because if he just castles here, lets white play f4, it does look preferable for white here. It seems like white's going to have a little bit of an edge because, let's say pawn takes, bishop takes. It's a nice position, right? He'll play c4, queen d2, maybe have ideas with bishop h6, just double on the f-file potentially, maybe even play g4 somewhere. It seems like white just has a little bit more space, and the presence of these opposite colored bishops makes it a little bit maybe easier for white to attack the black king. So Anish plays g5. Now, this kind of plan can actually be dangerous for white, right? If black can get to play rook g8, let's say, you know, in an ideal scenario, you get the pawn to h4, play g4, could be very, very dangerous. But Jan does have time here to prepare. So he plays rook e1, knight, rook g8, and knight f1. And this is a typical plan. The knight tries to come to e3 or g3 and have these squares in mind, which are weakened once the pawn is on g5. So now Anish plays g4, and even though I think white is better after this move, it's hard not to play it because let's say you play h5, for example, and knight e3. It's hard to just wait. Like if you just wait, then you know, white will. So you can't really play h4 here, for example, which, you know, would be nice if you could get h4 and g4. But here white just plays f3. G4 is blocked forever, and here it seems like white just kind of has easy play. They'll play, you know, c4, maybe bishop b2, b4, b5, d4. Just seems like white's going to make progress, and what is black's plan going to be? It's unclear, right? It's a block position, so it's not like it's lost for black or anything like that, but it seems pretty unpleasant. So I could see why Anish decided, you know, I'm not just going to sit idly, I'm going to play g4. White plays h4, of course, doesn't want to open up. You don't want to open up the position, even if it's not, you know, it's not like this is forced checkmate here, but you don't want to open up the g file. So he plays h4. And here again, Anish kind of goes for it here, and it's understandable because the position, if black just plays a developing move, white would play g3, locking up the king side, and then it's going to be the same thing I mentioned before, this plan with knight e3, c4, b4, b5. It just seems like white has so much more space that it's very unpleasant. So Anish plays g3 and sacrifices a pawn to get some activity. Pawn takes g3. Instructive move, right? You don't want to take this way because knight g4 would be very strong. The queen is threatening to come on h4, and it's not an easy position here for white to play. So pawn takes g3 is definitely the right move. Rook g6, and now he plays b4, trying to make progress on this side. Knight h5, and so this is sort of the idea behind rook g6, and so he's trying to attack the g3 pawn, but now Jan finds a very nice sacrifice. So it's clear, of course, Anish is not leaving his knight to be taken for nothing. He intends to play bishop g4. Now Jan does go for this, and of course it's not a blunder. He calculated very well and saw that this position after queen takes rook, pawn takes queen, he sacrificed the queen for a rook and a knight here, but he also gains a second pawn. So he's got 2 pawns because he has 8 pawns, right? White still has every single one of their pawns in a funny pawn structure, but still 8 pawns versus black 6. So materially, you know, rook knight plus 2 pawns is probably about even with a queen overall. But here I think white is actually much better because number 1 is they're going to have full control of the f-file. Number 2 is the king safety. This king is actually incredibly safe, right? Nothing will ever touch it on h2, for example. Number three, white has a little bit more space and the ability to play, c4, b5 or c4, c5 and bring this knight potentially to d5. So all these factors, I think white is actually much better here. It's a tough position. Let's see how the game goes. King d7, knight e3, bishop e6, rook f1. And this is important. White is able to seize the file here without black being able to really contest it yet. Queen h7. This move intends to force the bishop away so that he can try to fight for the open file. Unfortunately, he doesn't actually get there because white plays rook f6, and now he doesn't quite have time to play rook f8 because the pawn on a7 is not defended. So white would be able to take a third pawn, and that's really starting to be a lot of pawns. Note, by the way, this file, even though black has it here, every single square is completely controlled once or twice by white's pieces. So there's really not a lot for the queen to do on the f-file. And so here white would have kind of free play and eventually probably win the game. So Anish plays a6 first. Now threatening, so to speak, not that it's a threat, but wanting to fight for the open file. So of course Jan is just in time to play rook f1. Rook e8. White plays c4. Black doesn't have a lot to do here. It's sort of a waiting game and trying to see if white will make progress. He plays b6. Natural move. He's trying to potentially create a passed pawn on the queen side. Makes sense to try to get counterplay. And Jan plays knight d5. The knight is very strong here, especially after b6. It's hard to kick it out with c6. And if you take on d5, c takes d5, then the bishop's absence is going to make itself felt by a rook landing on f7, and again it's very hard to suggest what black can do next. So he plays king to c6. Now Jan plays rook f2, a good move. I wonder if he did see the move b5. Sometimes Jan does play very quickly, and I wonder if he saw the move b5 and rejected it. He may have decided that this inclusion, black can't take on b5 because of a fork, but he may have decided that this wasn't so strong. The computer loves this, though, potentially bringing the knight to c6, then playing c4 and getting a kind of a real bind. Certainly was a pretty interesting possibility as well. But Jan just plays rook f2. Queen g7, plays king h2, so white is not in a rush here. Black is almost without a plan. King b7. Hard to suggest a better waiting move. Knight c3, rook a8. And so this is a move that attempts to create counterplay with a5. And again, it seems like Jan is just always in time in this game to parry black's ideas. He plays rook f6, queen g8, and c5. And this is a very nice move. Sort of forces further weakening, and he wasn't afraid of the fact that black may get a passed pawn. Let's take a look at what happens if he takes on c5, b takes c5, and let's say he even tries to take the pawn. What's wrong with this? Well, here white has a nice sequence. He can play knight a4, threatening a fork, or even taking on e6 first. And on king c6, which defends the pawn, sort of the only way to defend the pawn, bishop e3 is very strong, and now the bishop actually it's creating a self pin, which is never ideal, and so black is in big trouble here. So he doesn't take on c5 and plays queen to e8. Now the knight comes back to d5. It's the same thing too, like this capture on d5 always looks like, oh, it should be good, but it's really not. Here the threat would be c6, and once again taking on c5 really does not help because the king just gets into big trouble. This is actually somewhat similar to the game where, after bishop h6 here, black has huge issues. So c5, queen e8, white plays knight to d5. He took on c5. Actually, he did play this. Sorry, there's not much else to suggest really because he's almost out of moves. Like if we try playing, what can we try here? If we try a5, for example, then the problem is that the opening of this position doesn't improve things at all. So after pawn takes a5, rook takes a5, white can simply play c4, follow it with rook b1 most likely, and things are just going to fall apart for black. And he can't really take with the b pawn because again now the king is in a really bad spot, and after rook b1 probably going to get checkmated very quickly here. For example, king c6 allows rook b6, and the king is forced to go to d7. King c5 would be mated here. So yeah, and then just about anything would be good, but I think especially rook b7, the king is kind of trapped again. So and we'll have also rook e7 somewhere. So yeah, so he takes both, and then after rook b1, king c8, bishop h6. The threat is rook f8, king d7, rook b7. The threat is rook takes c7. Also a threat of potentially knight b6. Got to be a little careful with maybe some kind of rook being attacked. So he takes on d5 because, again, so I guess the only other move would be rook c8. And then the simplest move is actually the quiet one here, to play rook a7 to threaten this, because you don't want to play knight b6, king c6, and suddenly this rook is really bad. But if you play rook a7, black is out of moves here. Knight b6 is now a threat. Even rook takes a6 is a threat because that bishop would be in trouble. It's kind of amazing how unfortunate black's kind of setup is here, in that he can't get any counterplay at all. That king on h2 is like in heaven. So after rook b7, he plays bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5. The threat now is to play d6. He plays king c8. Now king c8 can run into rook f8, so it's not the ideal move. But after rook b1, he just comes back. Now white plays rook f1, kind of renewing the threat of rook f8 because that rook in the back can fall, and also creating these ideas with rook f7 check. He plays rook d8. And now after rook f8, black, I think, played queen e7 or resigned. Anish was running out of time, but made the move and then would lose after rook f7. So that was a really, really pretty neat game from Jan Nepomniachtchi, who managed to win very convincingly after sacrificing his queen for sort of equal material but huge positional play. And that was a game that kind of set him on the right track for this match. He won the next game with black. This game was played in game 2. He won the next game with black and won the match 2.5 to half, which was also the score in the Magnus Carlsen Peter Svidler match. So a good day at the office for both Jan and Magnus. Keep in mind that either Jan or Anish would love to, and Peter, really, everyone except Magnus has additional stakes in this event, because if they win the event, they're going to qualify for the final of the tour with 4 players. So it's important for all of those guys to do well. And yeah, so this was an interesting opening, maybe one you haven't seen yet. I hope you enjoyed today's game of the day. We'll be back for more semifinal action tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining me. See you guys.